In this video, we're going to get an understanding of how subdivision levels work. So if I turn on the polyframe on this model is from the earlier video where we took Z-spheres and created this rough shape and then output geometry that has these polygroups, and it also has subdivision levels. So if we go over here into the tool area and open up geometry, you can see that we've got a slider here that lets us go up and down in our subdivision levels. And we talked about how basically when you subdivide the model, it's going to take each one of these polygons, so you can see this face here, and it's going to divide it into 4, and then it's going to smooth that out. So you can see if I step up to the next subdivision level, you can see how it's kind of divided that into 4 and smooth that out. And as we keep going up, we've got this going on here. So we can use this slider to go up and down in our subdivision levels, but it is a little bit easier to just use these hotkeys. So a lot of things inside of ZBrush, if you just hover your cursor over it, you'll see that you get a hotkey that's associated with whatever that is. So we can drop down in a subdivision level by hitting Shift D like this. And if we want to go to a higher resolution, we can just tap D. So it's pretty easy for us to move up and down in the subdivision levels. The next thing I want to introduce you to about subdivision levels is how ZBrush actually divides the model. So we talked about how it kind of smooths out the model as it divides it. I'm going to drop it down to the lowest subdivision level, and within inside of ZBrush we saw that we can go up and down in subdivision levels, but we can also say we don't want the higher subdivision levels anymore and we want to get rid of them. You can delete the higher subdivision levels, and you can also delete the lower subdivision levels. So right now the delete lower is grayed out because I'm at the lowest subdivision level, but if I step up in one, you can see now I can delete the higher, and I could delete the lower, but I want to go have this at the base cage here, so I can just hit delete higher again. So basically I've deleted all the subdivision levels and there's no more subdivisions going on this model. So right next to divide is this SMT button, which you can see if you hover it over there, it just says subdivide smooth modifier. So if we turn this thing off and I divide the model, you can see it's going to hold that exact shape, but it's just going to give me my divisions. So there might be times when you actually want this just to hold a specific shape, but you can see now that we've got more geometry to work with, we can actually sculpt on this thing, but it retained that low resolution kind of look. Now we could hold down Shift on any of our brushes. I'm going to tap X to turn on symmetry as well, and you can see you can smooth this out if you wanted, but I just wanted to point out to you that there is the possibility to hold that shape by turning off this SMT modifier. So we do have undo history here as well, which comes in pretty handy a lot of times. So all those operations that I just did, I want to get rid of all that stuff and get my model back to the state that it was at. And you can see by turning that button on and off, it's going to have a big impact over the way that the model looks as it's subdivided. The next thing I'd like to talk to you about subdivision levels has to do with the amount of resolution that we have to sculpt with. So if I tap B for my brushes to bring up the brush menu, if I hit S for standard and go to the standard sculpting tool here, I've got symmetry turned on, so I'm just going to tap X to turn that on and off. And I'm going to make my brush size a little bit lower, smaller. So I'm going to tap S and drag the slider to the left. So you can see if I sculpt right now, and I've got Z add on, make the brush a little bit bigger. You can see I'm pulling up the surface, but this model is pretty rough looking and not a lot of detail going on, right? So if I want, I can go ahead and keep dividing this model until I don't really necessarily see so much of the polygon level. Now whenever I sculpt on this model, you can see the detail is getting a lot smoother here. If I hold down Alt with that brush, I can go ahead and dig in like this. Okay, and I still see polygons here, so I can add another subdivision level, just hit Control D, and it's still smoothing that out. And then now maybe I can go through and actually even sculpt even more detail. So I'm just kind of lightly pushing on this on the high ridges of this. And then maybe hit these edges like this. Make my brush size a little bit smaller. Hold down Alt so I'm digging in. We've got this. And don't forget, if we hold down Shift at any point with these brushes, we can smooth some of the results out. So let's just say I've got some detail going on, right? And that looks pretty good. What I want to show with the subdivision levels, the power of subdivision levels, is that you could have this kind of detail, and let's say the art director comes by or somebody you're working with and they want you to change this chest area. So they want you to pull out the chest area and change the proportions, but you're worried about, you know, all this little kind of fine detail that you sculpted in here. You're going to go ahead and just drop down in the subdivision levels. So I'm going to hit Shift D, and I'm going to bring up the move brush. So I'm going to tap B and then go to M for move. Click this, make my brush size pretty large, tap S and then drag that up. And then I'm going to click and drag this surface out and really start affecting what's the overall proportions that I'm kind of looking at with this guy. So I want to fix this up a bit here, pull this out like this. I'll pull these things out, which I know there's no detail on the back, so that's not really that big of a deal. But I can change this here and start really kind of affecting the shape here. So now I've changed the overall proportions, and if we step back up in the subdivision level, so I'm going to tap D, you can see it's going to give this new shape that I have, and it's still going to retain most of the sculpt that I had. Now if you push the model too far and you stretch these things out, these polygons, that can be a problem. So that's an issue with subdivision levels. So later on we're going to take a look at the using Dynamesh, and that's a different way of sculpting that's geometry non-dependent. So it's just looking at shape all the time. But the whole power of the subdivision levels is that you can work in multiple resolutions on things and quickly change things like proportions and things like that on the model. You can see it even at this very low base cage kind of resolution. I can have a big effect over the overall look and shape of something, and I can keep stepping up into my subdivision levels. The last thing I'm going to talk to you about is some of the pitfalls that I see when using subdivision levels with brand new ZBrush users. And that basically has to do with the way that you work with your subdivision levels. So I'm just going to say this was our base cage that we have, and I'm going to delete all the higher subdivision levels just so we can start fresh. And really, you should not move up to the next subdivision level until you have some things resolved. Like you can see here, I'm going to use the move brush. So I'm going to tap B and then go to M and then find my move brush, which I'm already on there. But I need to really worry about large proportional things that I need to change with the model. So again, and with any brush at any time, you can hit Shift and smooth out with that. And maybe at these lower stages, if you ever want to pump something up or kind of blow it up, there's a brush called the inflate brush. So just imagine you're inflating a balloon. So you can tap B and then I to get the eye brushes, and then inflate is right here. So the opposite of kind of smoothing that thing out is kind of, you can blow these up if you want to get some more volume in certain areas like this. So push this back in here and I'll put it back on the move brush. So tap B, M, and move. And you can see it's getting kind of tedious to always do this to get my brushes. So in another video we're going to take a look at making, you know, hotkeys for our brushes and making custom things on the interface for that. So again, really use this subdivision level to kind of work out some things about proportions. You know, now I'm starting to get my head on this character is a little bit smaller, and then maybe I'm at the point now where I need to start stepping up in my subdivisions. I need a little more geometry to work with, because you can see back here in this area there's not a whole lot to play with. I can move these things and kind of get a general shape, but there's not much there. So usually whenever I can tell I kind of have pushed a model about as far as I can go shape wise with the amount of polygons that I have, then maybe it's time to think about adding a new subdivision level. So I'll go ahead and hit divide. So I've got this next subdivision level up. And again, just keep working on the overall proportions, because if you have a lot of subdivision levels, which means you have a lot of polygons, you got a lot more geometry to kind of worry about and think about. So just keep pushing this. And again, when you're working in 3D, you know, the only way that you can really kind of get an understanding of what you're really doing to this model in 3 dimensions is you need to do some changes and then spin around, because if you just look at one vantage point and I go, okay, I'm going to fix this arm out and get this thing the way I think it would look cool, and maybe the head in relationship to that, and this, and fix up the arm a little bit, then I might be tempted to say, wow, that looks pretty good and I think it's cool. But then you rotate to the front and you realize this is not, the shape isn't right, and it's, the shoulder needs to be brought up a bit more in here. The only way you're going to get that perspective is by rotating around the model. So I'm always constantly kind of sculpting and then moving the model immediately to kind of visually check. And as you get more experience with this, it's just something that you'll end up doing, and you won't really be thinking about it anymore. Just imagine in the real world, if you're working on a sculpture, it'd be kind of like sculpting on a little piece and then, you know, moving your body around the sculpture. So since we're not moving our body, we need to move the sculpture. And so we just do that by rotating the canvas around. But you can see at this stage with this many polygons, I'm starting to really kind of have a big effect on overall proportions and what is this character that I'm making and what does he kind of look like. You know. So here I am. I think I've pushed this pretty far. I could probably do a few more things to it, but I'm about at the point where I need more to work with here. So again, you're gonna kind of gain that perspective just through experience. But I think I'm gonna go ahead and divide it up again like this. Okay, so the main thing I want you to just kind of take away from this section right here that we're talking about is that you really need to work in stages. You really need to work with less kind of polygon, less topological information first, and then kind of build up later. So I like to just kind of point out that, just think if you were working in stone, if you're working in stone, you would knock away big chunks and get big shapes. And then as you progress in the sculpture, your tools get smaller and smaller, and the detail that you're kind of working with gets smaller and smaller until you get that final highly polished kind of look for your sculpture. But you don't want to be using the really fine chisels at the very beginning when you don't have a bunch of big stone knocked away, right? So when we work at this resolution, we're knocking away the big forms. And then once those big forms are kind of dealt with and we're happy with the shape, then it might be time to start working with more geometry and more detail at that point. Okay, so I think this is pretty good for this stage. In the next video, we're going to start looking at brushes more heavily and how to set those up to where we can use brushes and get to them easily, because one of my favorite sculpting brushes is the clay tubes brush, and I'm really feeling like I need that now. So I think I've pushed this about as far as I could with, you saw it's mainly just this move brush, just moving the shapes around and kind of pushing and pulling this clay, this digital clay around. And that's what you want to be doing at the very beginning stages. You want to get that shape and you want to get it prepped and ready for maybe some of these finer detail brushes. So let's go ahead and leave the sculpt here at this point for this stage.